Hello and welcome to our midweek devotion time. I'm Pastor Lauren and I am excited to be here with you to share a short devotion and a time of music led by some of our church musicians, David, Sarah, and Jeremy. Over the 4 Sundays in October, I'm leading our adults congregation in a study on the book of Philippians written by the Apostle Paul. We're talking about a chapter each Sunday right after worship. So if you're able to join us, I would love for you to join us. Worship in October is at 10 a.m. in the parking lot with Bible studies and small groups for all ages starting at 10:45 a.m. So I look forward to you joining us for those opportunities. If you're not able to come for Bible study though, or you're unable to stay after worship, I want you to know that over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be sharing some of what we've talked about at Bible study with you as part of the midweek devotion. I'll add a little bit more for those who were able to join us for Bible study, but this way, those adults who have not been able to join us, or even children and youth who want to learn a little bit more, can join us as well. So I want to give just a little bit of background about the book of Philippians and then share a little bit about what we talked about this past Sunday. So the book of Philippians was thought to be written, or is written, by the Apostle Paul. He was imprisoned at the time. It's unclear exactly when he wrote the letter, but it's thought to be around 50 or 51 AD. At that time, as he writes this letter to the Philippians, he is writing it in response to a visit from Epaphroditus, who has come from the church at Philippi to deliver him money to support him while he's in prison. While at the time of Paul being in prison and other prisoners at that time, you had to have support from other people to be able to be fed and to be cared for in the prisons. That wasn't always guaranteed if you didn't have someone sending support in. And so this church is supporting Paul, and it's clear that Paul loves the church at Philippi. He has a special friendship and partnership with them. He considers them to be people that he takes great joy in praying for and caring for. And so as Epaphroditus comes and gives him this support money, he sends a letter back with Epaphroditus to the church at Philippi. And so he must have gotten an update about how the community was doing at that time, and he offers them this encouragement. This is known often as the letter of friendship or letter of joy, because as I mentioned, Paul has such great heart for this group of people. They were a favorite church of his and a favorite group of people that he got to encourage. And so as we begin in chapter 1 of Philippians, there's a few themes throughout the whole book that are especially prevalent here in this book, in this chapter 1. And so I want us to just point out a few of those things. First, there's just this overwhelming gratitude for the church at Philippi. In verse 3, he says, "I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for all of you." It is clear that he believes the work they are doing is important and that he wishes he could be a part of that work with them. He goes on to pray for them and encourage them to not be worried about him. He wants them to know he is just fine, and they are to carry on this work of being united in Christ and of seeking wisdom and trusting in God. And he says this more clearly in verses 12 through 18, if you want to read along there. He says, "I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ." So, he could be really down on his luck. He could be sad about the situation, but instead he finds that there is joy even and good news, even in his imprisonment. He finds that he's able to share the gospel message with other people who are the guards and other prisoners. They're coming to know that he is in prison because of his fervor for Christ and his promise to declare the good news that Jesus forgives us and offers us love. And he even finds that other people are encouraged by his willingness to share in such a desperate time, and so others begin to share the message of Jesus too outside of the prison in other communities that Paul has touched. Another part of this story that is really beautiful to me is this emphasis on hope, that Paul does not stop hoping that God will be glorified, not just through him, but through the church at Philippi. And he makes this comment, which might be a well-known verse for you. In verse 21 and 22, he says, "For to me living in Christ is Christ, and dying is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which I prefer." So as Paul is thinking through his message to the Philippians, he's saying, if he doesn't know what's going to happen. Is he going to be released from prison? Will he be executed? And so he is going back and forth between those two options, and he says to them, if I die now, I know that the work I have done for Christ will further his kingdom. And I'll get to go be with Christ. And so dying is gain in that way for him. But he also knows that if he continues to live, Christ still has work for him to do with the Philippians, that Christ will still continue to call him to share the gospel, that there is still fruitfulness to be discovered and displayed for the world. I think this hope that he carries with him, this trust that no matter what, God is with him, is something to be admired, especially as we know what Paul's context was, that he was imprisoned at that time. There are ways that we feel as though the joys of our lives have been taken from us in the last few months. Certainly, we have not been imprisoned, and we don't know what sort of grief and trauma comes from that for Paul, but for us, we know what it's like to have been limited in the ways that we can interact with our brothers and sisters in Christ, the ways we feel like we've been limited in being able to share the gospel or be in community. And yet Paul is telling us in this passage that no matter our circumstances, we can still find ways to declare the gospel and to trust that God is with us. This story reminded me, this first chapter of Philippians reminded me of the hymn. It's one of my favorite hymns, "It Is Well With My Soul." And the story behind that hymn, you might be familiar with it. It was written by a Chicago Presbyterian layperson named Horatio Spafford, and he had gone through a really hard time in his life. He had bought a lot of real estate on the shore of Lake Michigan, and then in the 1871 Chicago fire, all of his holdings were wiped out. He had also lost his son right before that. And so after those hardships, he decided to send his wife and his 4 daughters to go on a European trip. He was going to go with them, but something came up and he was unable to sail across the ocean with them, and so he sent his wife and daughters ahead. But the ship that they were on was crashed into by another ship, and the only person in his family that survived was his wife. As he goes to be with her on the shore of this crash, Spafford is writing this hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." And we hear him saying there is sorrow in his life. He has had trials and trauma. In the first verse, he says, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrow like sea billows roll." He knows what it's like to feel darkness. And yet he quickly turns in his writing to joy, to hope, to trusting in God among him. As he says, "It is well with my soul," but he also goes on to say, there will be a day when I am united with Christ, and Christ has already taken my sin away. And these things, too, make it well with my soul. So might you be inspired by those words as we hear and sing this hymn together.